Let's face it, chances are high that everyone watching this video is a fan of the Final Fantasy series, or at least knows a lot about it. Of course, it's Square Enix's flagship RPG series. What you may not be aware of though is that in the 1990s, Square was cultivating a rival RPG series, the SaGa franchise, and dedicated just as much energy to it. In fact, when Final Fantasy IV was in development, both series had an equal number of games. When it came time to release Romancing SaGa for the Super Famicom in 1992, it's safe to say that many RPG fans anticipated it in the same way they anticipated Final Fantasy IV. Now, it is true that Romancing SaGa was eventually remade as Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song for the PlayStation 2. In 2022, that version was also remastered and re-released for Android, iOS, Steam, Switch, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5, but we'll get to that part later, because my first experience with the game was with the original SNES version, or more accurately, the Super Famicom version, because this game was never originally localized in North America. If you want to play that version, you can still pick up a fully translated English patch at the link in the description and play this one in its original form. Regardless of which version you play, the story and basic mechanics are similar, even if the visual presentation in the remake is quite a bit different. Romancing SaGa utilizes several mechanics that made it stand out from other RPGs. First, when you fire up the game, you select from one of 8 protagonists, each of which has a different story and special abilities. Once you make this choice, it's locked in for the entire game, but it really doesn't change the main story narrative too much outside of a unique, character-specific opening scenario. In fact, this and the other Romancing SaGa games feature a very non-linear approach, and you aren't locked into a set chain of events as in other RPGs. There is an overarching narrative, but you're given a lot of freedom to explore, complete various quests, and trigger storyline events in an order of your own choosing. The game's creators called this the free scenario system, and it's influenced all other SaGa games since. Another unique facet to the Romancing SaGa games is that there aren't random encounters. Instead, enemies appear on the screen that you can walk past and evade. Generally, the enemies move toward you and try to attack you as you walk by though, so it's difficult to avoid them all. Like the other SaGa games, Romancing SaGa doesn't even have actual levels either. Instead, you have a random chance to gain stat increases after battles in which you performed an action tied to that stat. For example, if you use a sword against an enemy in battle, you have a chance to gain a hit point raise. Using martial arts makes it possible to gain agility increases, and using spells gives you a chance to have your BP raised. And speaking of BP, that's a stat similar to magic points in other RPGs. Each skill takes a specific amount of BP to use. Unlike other RPGs, each character's hit points are fully replenished after every battle, which makes healing in between battles a non-factor. Characters can equip several weapons, and each equipped weapon opens a new subset of up to 4 skills that can be used in battle once the weapon is fully leveled up. It does take some time grinding to gain access to all of each weapon's skills, which incentivizes long-term use of powerful ones. Also, you can use up to 6 characters in a party at a time, and characters are placed in formations with 3 columns of rows. Characters in the front row take and deal the most damage, characters in the back row take less damage and deal less damage, and attacks and defense of the middle row characters are averaged out. In other words, it's a lot like the Final Fantasy games, just with a middle row added. The only problem with this is that unless you engage the enemy in battle head-on, your formation will be disrupted, and you may have to spend turns changing rows to avoid taking too much damage or hampering your ability to deal damage. The last thing in this long list of characteristics unique to Romancing SaGa games is the character recruitment style. There isn't a set order to recruit characters, so you're free to basically explore the world, trigger storyline sequences, and find who you can. There were parts of the game where you can get stuck with a few characters for long lengths of time until you find others, but I did notice that some of the characters can be obtained from pubs. In all honesty, Romancing SaGa can be a frustrating and difficult game if you can't recruit enough characters fast enough, and it's easy to be outnumbered by enemies in the beginning part of the game. But I guess that's the allure of the game's free-roaming open-ended style also. As far as the story goes, Romancing Saga takes place in the world of Mardius. A war long ago raged between three wicked gods, Death, Saruin, and Shirach on one side, and the Lord of all gods Elor on the other. At the end of the conflict, Death and Shirach were stripped of their powers, and Saruin was imprisoned through the power of the 10 Fate Stones, which were given to a legendary hero named Mursa for safekeeping. After the passage of 1,000 years, though, the Fate Stones were lost and scattered throughout the world, causing the forces of evil to awaken from their slumber and set out to free Saruin. 8 heroes then emerged to counterbalance the dark forces, which happen to be the protagonists you can select from. Each has wildly different backgrounds and personalities, but all of them have the potential to, you guessed it, save the world. The soundtrack for Romancing Saga was created by Kenji Ito, who worked on the second Saga title on the Game Boy as well. I especially enjoy the main theme, which became a staple for the series and was incorporated into Romancing Saga 2 and 3 as well. You'll find a great assortment of fantasy tunes here that aren't too unlike the quality of the work of Nobuo Uematsu. Because the two work together at times, it's also quite possible they influenced each other's style. Each of the 8 protagonists have their own theme, which are honestly really good, and there's a lot of other great tracks too. In my mind, this soundtrack deserves 5 stars, it's really good. As I mentioned earlier, Romancing Saga was remade and repackaged into Romancing Saga Minstrel Song for the PlayStation 2, then remastered and re-released in 2022 for many modern platforms. This version retains the story and most of the mechanics exactly, but the graphical presentation uses an exaggerated, cartoony style that gives the characters big heads. It also uses a combat system that looks much more like the newer Saga games. Now don't get me wrong here, I'm glad Square Enix finally found a way to modernize the game so a North American audience could play it in an official capacity for the first time. But as you guys know, I'm old school, so I like the original graphical style more. I just have to admit, the cartoony look seemed to me to cheapen the serious fantasy motif the game was going for. I think Square Enix did a way better job preserving the original feel with the Romancing Saga 2 remaster than with this one, but they were clearly going for a different approach there. Overall, Romancing Saga is a good early Super Famicom era RPG that a lot of people missed out on. It used many unique concepts creatively, especially for the time, and gave the player a sense of exploration not found in many other titles like this. The difficulty level is a little too high, and there's way too many swarms of enemies at times. I mean, just look at this. Ah! And this. No! Just realize that the lack of random encounters certainly doesn't mean less encounters. But hey, if you can get over those things, there's a lot to love here about Romancing Saga. I think most fans of retro RPGs will really like it if they haven't tried it. Just don't expect a pure Final Fantasy clone. 2 years after Romancing Saga was released, Square capitalized on its success by releasing its sequel, Romancing Saga 2, in December of 1993. It represented a big step forward for the series in several ways, especially graphically. Even so, the title retained many of the same elements that made the first Romancing Saga game stand out in the Super Famicom's early period. Of course, Romancing Saga 2 wasn't released to a North American audience on the SNES, so it truly lurked in the shadows of RPG history for decades. Over the years, various teams produced incomplete English translation patches, but the game was never fully translated. Unfortunately, this caused Romancing Saga 2 to become forgotten by most Western enthusiasts. That was, however, until Square Enix remastered the game in 2017 and released it on several modern platforms, including Steam, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. The new version uses classic sprites, but improves the environments to fit the widescreen view, revamps the menus, incorporates a brand new English script, completely remasters the original soundtrack, and even adds some animated enemies. All the main storyline and character details remain totally intact. Let me just make one thing clear right here. I was extremely critical of the Minstrel Song re-release of the original Romancing Saga game. but believe me when I say that the Romancing Saga 2 remaster is exceptionally good. It's the definitive way to enjoy the game now, and it doesn't revolutionize the title to such an extent that old school retro fanatics like me would be alienated. The classic feel is still here. Combat in Romancing Saga 2 works a lot like it does in the original Romancing Saga game. You can choose to attack or use a host of abilities against enemies each turn, and your HP and MP are refilled after each battle. The damage you deal and take is greatly influenced by the formations of your characters, which are preset in this one, but there are still 3 rows. You start with only 1 formation, but gain more as the game goes along. Formations can help you protect weaker members and amplify the damage of the high damage dealers. It still uses the stat-based advancement system rather than traditional leveling, and players learn new skills through the Glimmer system. This means that you have a chance of learning new abilities in each battle, and the chance of this is increased if you are facing tougher enemies and if you have only a small number of abilities already. You'll know right away when a new ability has been learned in this way because you see a light bulb appear over your character's head, followed by the first use of the new technique. I noticed that I learned many new abilities during boss fights, presumably because they're more difficult. The system is random to some extent, but it's always fun to learn something new out of the blue. The story for Romancing Saga 2 begins as a tale by the unofficial series mascot, Howlon, a bard in a tavern. As he strums his harp, he recounts that the land of Avalon was once a small country fraught with war and conflict. The first emperor, Leon, had 2 sons, Victor the Brave and Gerard the Kind. As he starts to explain that Leon took Gerard to hunt one day in an evil quarry, the game's events actually begin. The main idea here is that the story narrative takes place over a series of generations. The focal point of the tale is the legend of the 7 Heroes, a group that once rose to banish a great evil long ago, but vanished without a trace afterward. At one point the entire world sang their praises, but with the passage of time, they become totally forgotten. In Romancing Saga 2, the 7 heroes return to the land, turn into demons, and terrorize the world. As the Emperor of Avalon, it's up to you to put a stop to them. Of course, it's a Saga game, so the narrative is pretty loose and you have freedom to explore the world, recruit companions, and complete objectives in a very open-ended order. At several junctures, you're also presented with key decisions that do alter specific parts of the game. Even though Romancing Saga 2's combat system is similar to its predecessor, several other mechanics weren't. For instance, this one uses an innovation called the inheritance system. This means that during the course of the game, the player controls several different protagonists in succession, starting with the first Emperor of Avalon, Leon. If your entire party is defeated in battle, a long period of time has passed, or Leon's hit points are reduced to 0, the current Emperor will be replaced with a new one in a defined line. While it seems like this would make a big difference on the story, it really doesn't very much other than cosmetic differences between the old and new rulers. You also lose the rest of your party, but you're easily able to recruit new companions in each generation with comparable stats anyway. It's all based on an invisible meter that fills up as you play. It is kind of wacky too that you don't even obtain the character you name at the very beginning of the game until way later in the story, as he becomes the final emperor. By the time you get him though, you'll probably forget you even named anyone specially. Unlike the first Romancing Saga game, skills aren't directly tied to weapons in this one, so you never have to stress upgrading to a new weapon and losing all of your existing abilities. And if you ask me, this was the best change over the original. It makes it so much more enjoyable to mix and match weapons and abilities without worrying about sacrificing too much. Also, your currency is called crowns, but you don't gain them directly from battle. The number in your treasury is tied to the quests you've completed and the number of battles you've won in the game. You can only carry up to 10,000 crowns at a time for personal use though, and that is a bit odd. But the crowns in your treasury can be used to upgrade your castle to open up new quests and NPCs, which is pretty cool. It reminds me a bit of the castle building you do in the Suikoden games. Kenji Ito produced the soundtrack for Romancing Saga 2, just like the previous game, and I think it sounds great. It's packed with both uplifting and somber tracks and will be familiar to you if you know his other work. The re-release version of the soundtrack is especially awesome and really deserves some praise. These tracks were reworked in masterful fashion and breathed new life into the music. Battle of the Emperor and Encounter with the Seven Heroes are both great songs, but the main theme is probably my absolute favorite. That's the sound most people associate with the Romancing Saga games after all. I would say my gripes with Romancing Saga 2 pretty much match the ones I had with the original. I loved how you could avoid some enemy encounters, but there's just so many enemies packed into various areas that fighting your way through dungeons becomes a real tedious nightmare at times. Parts of this game are also beyond punishing unless you're adequately stat boosted. It's pretty unforgiving and the game really makes you grind. Also, some of the magic spells are just ridiculously overpowered and make the weapon abilities look like a joke. There could have been a lot more balance that went into this. All in all though, Romancing Saga 2 is a really fun RPG, and it was made so much better through the modern remake. Its combat system and abilities are fun to use, and the title is filled with enjoyable fantasy lore and other elements that made the series so unique. The inheritance system was a good idea that made you feel as if you were controlling a kingdom rather than specific characters, but I guess it did have some shortcomings too. The remake also adds a challenging new bonus dungeon and several new classes. There's also a New Game Plus feature, which is really nice. So yeah, I think Romancing Saga 2 is absolutely worth picking up from Steam for retro RPG fans. I've noticed that it commonly goes on sale there for over 50% off, and it's already at a reasonable price, so definitely keep a lookout for those bargains. Following the success of Romancing Saga 2, Squaresoft released Romancing Saga 3, the sixth title in the SaGa series of role-playing games, in 1995. The game was a big hit in Japan and was considered one of the company's flagship titles on the Super Famicom. Even though it sold 1.3 million copies, the game never made its way to North America, which is a true shame. Thankfully, the game has since received a fan translation, making it possible for English-speaking players to experience the game today. The SaGa series is famous for adopting an extremely non-linear style of gameplay, which emphasizes open-world exploration and a branching plot, where there's considerably more freedom than in games like Final Fantasy. Of course, Romancing Saga 3 is no exception. In addition, the character development system in the game is based on an idea utilized in Final Fantasy II, where individual stats are increased when abilities or circumstances tied to those stats are used in battle. For instance, the character has a chance to receive an agility boost after using short swords and martial arts attacks. In the same way, strength has the chance of being boosted after using large swords, hand axes, or large axes. The story of Romancing Saga 3 is centered upon a cataclysmic event, the Death Eclipse, which appears on the Earth every 300 years. This event occurs when a star travels in front of the sun, blocking its light and causing a ruinous eclipse that destroys all the life on the planet. About 600 years ago, one child miraculously lived through this catastrophe and became an all-powerful being called the Devil King. He ruled the world as a tyrant, opened up an abyss filled with devil lords, and released them onto the world. However, one day he mysteriously vanishes. After the death eclipse of 300 years ago, a single child survived yet again, but this time he did not become an evil lord. He instead became a legendary hero and a holy king. He vanquished the devil lords that remained and closed the entrance to the abyss. The death eclipse hit the world yet again about 10 years prior to the events of the game, while the whole world waits for the new child of destiny, and a lot of tension looms over whether he'll be a devil king or holy king. In Romancing Saga 3, the player is given the choice at the beginning of the game to select a main character out of 8 choices. Each character is thrust into the center of a war between Godwyn, the rebellious minister of the kingdom of Loan, and Mikhail, the king of Loan. The game's story unfolds differently depending on the character you select, but it is also affected by the events that have already occurred, what is said in conversations, and who is present in the party. Even still, at a high level, the story is mostly the same overarching narrative. As one of the game's highlights, combat utilizes a turn-based combat system that will be familiar to most fans of the genre.
Each character can execute and unlock a series of techniques. These techniques are divided by weapon type, giving each weapon a specific set of techniques. There is also magic in the game, but it isn't dependent on weapon type. Unlike some RPGs, the characters leap across the screen and execute unique animations for techniques and spells. Some of these attacks were just downright awesome, and it really was a cool facet of the game that wasn't done in many other RPGs at the time. Formations for combat are also a great touch, and the game is very customizable in this way. Different formations allow you to make strategic decisions to survive battles, and this is especially useful for the boss battles. Unfortunately, the stat-based progression system the game offers seems to be a bit arbitrary and frustrating. During the early parts of the game, stat progression is relatively steady, with skill-ups occurring consistently. However, by the end of the game, you reach a point where some stat increases reach a near standstill, which only encourages painful grinding. Also, weapon skill-ups require finding specific types of enemies and using specific skills ad nauseum in the hopes that a skill-up will occur. Although this type of progression system is a hallmark of the SaGa franchise, I can say that games like Romancing Saga 2 and SaGa Frontier didn't seem nearly as tedious. Although the skill-up system has some faults, I think the game's technique system is a unique high point. In Romancing Saga 3, new techniques are learned through preconditions that make the character think of the technique during combat. New techniques can only be learned by using the new skill's parent technique enough times in battle to trigger the process. When this occurs, you see a little light bulb animation and perform the new technique for the first time. Using the new techniques enough times will allow the character to master it. There are some other odd quirks about the game, like the inability to have access to items in combat. Instead, items are only available from the menu screen, and there is very limited space for them. Also, unlike games like Final Fantasy, your party's hit points refill to full after battle, which is actually pretty convenient. It's just something to get used to. It's also possible to save almost anywhere in the world. The game's storyline really has some high and low points. Overall, I found the character development in Romancing Saga 3 to be lacking. I actually thought the premise for the game's overarching story was great and really unique. However, the same cannot be said when it comes to the characters, where the game kinda keeps you hanging. During the introduction sequences, the character development is actually quite strong, but these moments are seemingly abandoned after a certain point. Also, the party's eventual objective in the game is to beat the 4 bosses of the Abyss, but I don't think the game does a very good job of explaining why. If you're expecting the game's story to be something like Final Fantasy VI, you'll be disappointed. That's not to say that what is there is particularly bad though, it's just not as riveting as some of its counterparts. The music of Romancing Saga 3 was composed by Kenji Ito, who had also composed the previous 2 games in the SaGa series, Romancing Saga and Romancing Saga 2. There are 68 tracks comprising an immense variety of themes and moods to fit the game's story. Out of all the soundtracks Ito has done that I have listened to, I think this one's actually the best, and honestly the music is probably the best aspect of Romancing Saga 3. A few of my favorite songs include the opening theme, Boss Battle, Mikhail's theme, and Demon King Palace. The graphics in Romancing Saga 3 are about at the level one would expect from a game of its time, and look pretty reminiscent of Final Fantasy VI. In battle, the sprite attack animations are much more advanced when compared to many of the games of the era though, as are the spell effects. The backgrounds won't blow you away or anything, but the colors are vibrant, and there's lots of differing environments the game offers. No matter how you slice it, North American RPG fans certainly missed out on this game, and it is more than worth it to revisit it today. However, the SNES translation that is widely available unfortunately leaves much to be desired, as there's some awkward grammar and sentence structure there.
For all those who missed out on Romancing Saga 3 in the SNES era, the great thing is that Square Enix remastered the game completely in 2019. It was brought to Steam, Switch, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One, and man, this is a fantastic version of the game to play. It truly retains the original look, feel, story, and gameplay specifics that made the original title so great. The gorgeous environments, ability animations, and original sprites are still intact here, and all of it looks great. The new version even incorporated a fully remastered soundtrack by original composer Kenji Ito, and it sounds really incredible. And if all of that wasn't enough, Square Enix even added several new storylines and a new bonus dungeon called the Phantom Maze to challenge the hardest core players. But hey, I'm a Chrono Trigger fanatic, so I think the best addition was actually the New Game Plus feature, which is about the best gift you could possibly give any RPG fan. Adding this feature allows players to complete the game with multiple protagonists while retaining all their money, stats, techniques, spells, and equipment from the previous game. Rather than reinvent the entire experience, which Square Enix has done sometimes, the remake brought the original title into a new age, and it's totally worth picking up from Steam. It also commonly goes on sale there for more than half off, so definitely be on the lookout for those deals. When it all comes down to it, Romancing Saga was one of the greatest series of retro RPGs in its era, but all three of the games just got completely overshadowed in the West. Square's decision back then not to bring any of these titles to North America was a true shame, but they've definitely redeemed themselves since then by bringing them all here in some form. While I'm not the biggest fan of the minstrel song version of the original Romancing Saga game, Romancing Saga 2 and 3 are both fantastic remasters that really live up to the quality we know and expect from Square Enix. The three Romancing Saga games were a key part of the larger Saga franchise that really has grown huge over time. Some of us in the West got our first taste of it through the Final Fantasy Legend games on the Game Boy, as those were the first three Saga games in Japan. Others first played the series via the Saga Frontier games on the PlayStation, or through Unlimited Saga on the PlayStation 2. Still others played the Romancing Saga games in whatever form we could back then, whether it be import versions or English patches. No matter which you played first though, it's undeniable that the Romancing Saga games greatly influenced all Saga games that came after them to a huge extent. I would even go as far as to say they represented the golden age of Saga. Sure, they were developed alongside the biggest name Square giants like Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger, and were definitely overshadowed by those games in many ways. Even still, they stood out as their own distinct thing outside of those games. So whether it's for all those zany sprite animations, the free scenario gameplay and story, or even the stat and ability-based advancement system, it's clear to me that the Romancing Saga games deserve far more attention than they've gotten. So how would you rank the three Romancing Saga games? Which one was the best? Also, do you have any fun or nostalgic memories playing them? Let me know in a comment below. As always, please like, subscribe, and click the bell for more retro gaming content. If you want early access to the videos I produce and other perks, please consider supporting the channel by becoming a Patreon patron or via the YouTube Join feature.